Welcome to Stories of Brisco and Bradshaw. I would be Bradshaw. That would be your Chickasaw native, your Chickasaw Hall of Famer, Oklahoma's favorite son, Mr. Gerald Brisco. And we got a huge treat today. Worked for WWE, worked for the WWE magazines, got his own podcast, Shut Up and Wrestle. Got a wonderful book out that I cannot wait to discuss, Blood and Fire, the unbelievable story of the original Sheik, that's out right now, and a book coming out in September about a favorite of me and Mr. Brisco, and that is Gorilla Monsoon. He is Mr. Brian Solomon. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys.
Well, Brian, we really appreciate you being here. The title of the book, Shut Up and Wrestle. That's what I had to tell Layfield several times, because every time we go after Gorilla, he'd always want to bullshit about today's politics. I just shut up and get out. But today I'm going to let him talk all he wants to, because we got a great subject here, a very controversial guy, and a guy that's kind of intriguing to a lot of guys. And if people have never studied the history of NWA wrestling or professional wrestling in itself, the Iron Sheik is a guy, and what a better way to do it than to pick up your book, right?
I hope so. I just want to point out, because this happens a lot on podcasts, not the Iron Sheik, right? He's the other guy. This is the original Sheik. I remember I did one show where about halfway through, and these were people that didn't know a ton about wrestling. About halfway through the podcast, I realized, hey, this guy thinks I wrote a book about the Iron Sheik. And I had to, correct him. But
Brian,
yeah.
why is it? Me and Brisco have always kind of wondered about the original Sheik, Eddie Farhat. Why is there not much more about him? I mean, people talk a lot about all the other promoters of Eddie Graham, Jim Crockett, Vern Gagne, Fritz von Erich. There's not a lot about the original Sheik. Why is that?
I think it's just time, honestly. I mean, part of the reason is most of those guys you mentioned, they lingered on into the WWE kind of expansion era, and they were kind of going to war or being put out of business and things like that. And but with the Sheik, he was already done. That's a lot of people don't realize or remember that. He was sort of like Roy Shire in San Francisco and the Funks and some of these people that they were already done. So Vince and the WWF had nothing to do with the Sheik going out of business, because big time wrestling in Detroit went under in 1980. And not only did it go under in 1980, they were on the decline already for about 4 or 5 years. So I just think it's time. So much time's gone by. A lot of the people, I ran into this when I wrote the book, a lot of the people that worked for him, not around anymore, unless they were maybe rookies at the time, people like Mike Doyle and people like that. But it's just people forget. That's why I wrote the book.
I know we're jumping way far ahead, but I want to ask this question while it's on the top of my head. Vince McMahon and Junior, as we called him, Vince McMahon, and the Sheik, was a threat ever made? Was the meeting? Did that happen?
I know it's that crazy story, and it's funny that you bring it up, because I had to address it in the book. The way I wrote the book was this: I didn't want to leave stories out, but if there's a story that I can't prove or I don't know about, if it's true or not, I just say that. I'm not going to pass it off as a fact. I'm just going to say, hey, look, a lot of people say this may have happened. There was a story that apparently Vince and Kay McMahon, he had an issue with the Sheik. He had an axe to grind. Some people said it was an old beef that went back to his father, some falling out that they had. And a lot of people had theories about it, because the Sheik never worked for Vince Sr. after a certain point, like early 70s. He just stopped coming in. So people thought there was some kind of issue that maybe Vince was trying to air this out. Some people, this story, I think, started with, believe it or not, George the Animal Steele, supposedly, because George Steele was a student of the Sheik and his, I forget the name of his trainer there that he had over there. He came out of that area, Michigan. And apparently George Steele had this claimed that Vince set up this meeting with the Sheik the first time he came into Detroit, which would have been late 1983, and that he did it strictly to humiliate him and make him beg for a job and all this kind of thing. I kind of find it a little far-fetched myself, but it's a really interesting story. I heard from some people that Vince offered him a job, that he sort of wanted to make him the promoter of the Detroit area, like he was doing for other people in other areas. And that the Sheik just didn't see himself that way. That was one of his biggest problems. He still wanted to be the star. I mean, and this was a guy who was pushing 60, I guess, at that time. he still wanted to be on top and promote in Detroit and also wrestle. And when that wasn't in the cards, it just didn't work out. But I think it's one of those stories that really gets blown out of proportion. I'm sure there was some type of an issue there at some point, but when there's money to be made in wrestling, people aren't going to leave that on the table. That's what I think.
So you don't know for sure if that meeting ever really happened.
No, I couldn't prove it, and I would love to have asked Vince about that, but I didn't have the opportunity. But I can't prove that it happened. It's mentioned in the book as something that people claimed happened. I mentioned in the book that George Steele claimed for sure that it happened. I'm not sure if he claimed to have been there, but he claimed that it happened. But I couldn't prove it to my own satisfaction to be able to say this is a fact. This absolutely happened.
Mr. Brisco, have you heard about that meeting that was allegedly happened?
I've heard about the meeting, and I talked to George Animal Steele one time about it because I've always been curious about Sheik because, John, as I've discussed with you and Brian probably knows, back in the Georgia expansion days, I was the one in charge of setting up all those venues in Detroit and Michigan, Ohio, and West Virginia, where it was considered Sheik's territory. We'll get into that a little bit later about the NWA part of it, but they wouldn't go into each other. But going into those towns, I always had difficulty because Sheik had left a trail of IOUs around all tri-state area that was almost impossible to overcome. But George had told me that because when I first started meeting George, I was doing local promotion. And he asked me, I had experience in Detroit, and I said, yeah. And so we started talking about the Sheik. And he said, well, I tried to get Sheik the job, but Sheik didn't want the job. And basically, that was it. We kind of just left, because I wasn't a big Sheik fan either. So I just kind of left that up in the air when he said, no, Sheik didn't want the job. But I couldn't figure out why, because at that time, it was a great paying job.
I think that's what it came down to. I do believe that happened, that he was offered a spot and he just didn't want it. And he just couldn't. Part of the thing that I found was that he just couldn't let go. There were a lot of people that came on board and he was offered a spot to be one of those people, and he just didn't want it. He had some of these ideas, like you were talking about, how when Georgia Championship Wrestling was coming up into some of the areas that used to be his, and I stressed used to be. That's the thing. Ohio, West Virginia, Michigan. I think Crockett was going in there too, and he was still acting like it was his, and he hadn't even promoted there in years. It was this attitude of, well, I bought it, which is true. He paid Jim Barnett and Johnny Doyle for it, and he felt like, well, nobody paid me. I paid for it. No one's paid me, so it's still mine. And nobody agreed with that view of reality. And I remember reading somewhere even that in the beginning, and maybe you can confirm it, that Ole Anderson was paying almost like a fee to the Sheik for some of those shows, until he reached a point where he sort of said, well, why do I need to pay this guy? Why am I paying this guy? For what reason? And it was almost like a shakedown. And then he stopped paying him.
Well, I never saw that in my experience there running those territories where we set aside a Sheik payoff. I never saw that myself. So
there was someone who I wish I could remember who it was. All this research is from years ago, but somebody had told me.
I wouldn't doubt it if it only didn't make that offer. And
right.
And through Jim Barnett, though, because Jim was very conscientious of what towns we run, because Brian, as you know, cable was busting open, and there were towns available all over. I mean, we could have gone into Geigel's territory, but no, he was still a member of the NWA. But and she could, and we'll get into it a little bit later.
Yeah.
But I'm just generalizing on the deal. But I don't ever, because I made the settlements with all the Michigan and Ohio and West Virginia towns. I made all the settlements with those towns. And if there was any money coming out, it was never earmarked for any far hat promotion or anything like that. It was just the opposite. We had to fight like crazy because of the past due bills that Sheik owed these television stations, owed the newspapers, and owed radio promotion. So it was probably the most difficult place I've ever had was assigned to get off the ground, just simply because of the reputation. A lot of people just flat did not want to work with us because of the impression that Sheik left about professional wrestling.
Yeah, and I heard that from other people that were trying to promote in that area, that they would say, "Well, look, if you want to run here, here are these bills that we have that are unpaid from the guy that used to run here. If you could make good on all this, then we'll let you run here." And it was kind of a pain. In fact, somebody said, I don't think it was you, because I don't think I interviewed you for the Sheik book, but somebody said in one of those early, when the WWF started coming in, that people came knocking on their door too, especially, and they mixed up the Iron Sheik and the Sheik.
Yeah.
They came down there and they saw the Iron Sheik was on the card, and they said, "Well, this guy owes us money." And they had to explain to them, "Well, that's a different Sheik. That's not the original Sheik. That's a different Sheik." But even when Vince came in that territory, the person he was dealing with, and this shows you how far out of the loop Sheik really was by this point, was George Cannon. George Cannon was the guy who was the closest thing to running that territory, whatever that meant. And he was the guy that Vince kind of contacted and tried to do business with to be the Detroit promoter. The Sheik was a non-entity for like 2 or 3 years by that point. He just didn't.
You're exactly right on.
Hey, Mr. Briscoe, put your microphone closer to you.
Okay, you're exactly right on Cannon, because he did take over the promotion spot there in the Michigan area, but I think it was just Michigan. I don't think it was Ohio, but
Right.
yeah, that the residual effect. I mean, I was friends with a building manager in Saginaw, Michigan. He wanted to shoot Sheik. He owed him so much money. Not only owed the building and the city money, but owed the manager of the building money personally. That the building manager, and we went in there, and when we were going in there, my first round of bookings, we had to pay 3 months in advance for building dates. That's unheard of. I mean, people, you just didn't do that back then. But it was all because of the Sheik, and that's the reason I always had this built up anger. Not only that, but we'll get in a little bit my brother's bad experience with the Sheik, and then seeing how the Sheik actually ran his business and owed everybody. It was a hard job to overcome the past, and that's I hate to say it, but people like Sheik, they always had that perception about professional wrestling being low rent. He filled the bill on a lot of business meetings there.
Yeah, that's true. I think there was a lot of desperation. That's really those last years were really, really tough. From about 1975 to 80, those were very hard years, and their business was just circling the drain. And he was doing, that's when he really was shortchanging people and not paying people and doing all these shady things because they were losing so much money. There's that famous story I'm sure you guys have heard, because it's been told a million times, about the Funks coming up there to try to help out in those dying days and working a Kobo card, and the biggest stars on the show by far. And then Eddie Farhat Jr., his son, because the Sheik was not there that night, he was somewhere else, who runs into the locker room and claims at the end of the night that the cash box got stolen and they have no money. Terry Funk told me that himself, and I know he's told that many times. I mean, come on,
Jerry, that's never happened before, like in the Bahamas.
Bahamas, it was an every other month situation.
Yeah, Brian, you know the story. This happened in the Bahamas with Mr. Briscoe during the Florida territories. The guy, Mr. Briscoe, he won't say his name, but
Lester Welch. I won't tell you.
Lester Welch. So Lester used to claim he got rolled on the way to the airport after every Bahamas show. So all the guys would go to the Bahamas. Now they're having a great time down there, beautiful women, sun and beach and all the stuff, all the
right.
things. So nobody would complain, but they Lester claimed he got rolled every single time and they never got paid.
Wow, that's a real problem. He should have personal security or something.
Well, Jerry offered to carry for him one time. He goes, no, I'll be fine. It won't happen this time. Of course, it happened again.
Yeah, and that's how you burn bridges. I mean, and the word spreads of that, and then people don't want to come there and work for you anymore. You know.
Yeah,
So,
but
Brian,
prior to all these bad things about Sheik, in the beginning, Sheik had to be a very bright businessman. I mean, he bought the territory, from Johnny Doyle and Jim Barnett, right? But before
Yeah.
that, I mean, tell us a little bit about pre-Sheik when he over in was it Syria that he's from, and he left his parents and bought a ticket or got a ticket
hey,
somehow over.
hey, Brian, just before you do, and I want to get to that
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
that's a good idea, Mr. Briscoe. But I want to ask one more thing about the meeting because I'd heard Vince talk about this meeting a little bit, but I don't remember that much about what he said. But the meeting Vince was talking about was a little bit different. The parameters of it. Sheik was very mad about Vince coming in and had threatened Vince.
Yeah.
And Vince showed up for that meeting just to kind of say, "Hey, you're not going to threaten me. You know, we'll do business together." I don't know what business was discussed, but I know at least what story I heard from Vince himself was that he showed up to the Sheik meeting because Sheik said, "Don't you dare show up." And you tell Vince McMahon that he's going to show up every time.
Right, and that's one of the things I heard. I heard there was a version of the story that somebody told me that said that the Sheik was literally on his knees begging for a job, which I highly doubt he would ever do, but that was a version of
Vince
it.
didn't say anything about that. He didn't say anything about Sheik asking for a job. He didn't say anything. He didn't say anything bad about the Sheik. By the way, I heard him talk about the Sheik, and heard him talk about that meeting. Vince McMahon never said one bad word about the Sheik. It was all about the Sheik.
Vince never did really downgrade any of those guys. I mean,
That's right. It was all about the fact that the Sheik had said, "Don't you come in?" And Vince is, Vince is one of those guys that when you threaten him, he bows up, and he's exactly opposite of what you ask.
Yeah, and I believe that Sheik that's something that he would have done because he was very defensive of all that. In fact, even we were talking about Jim Barnett, and Barnett was in a lot of ways, this is in the book, was really important to the early part of the Sheik's career because not only did he sell him the territory, but even before that in the 50s, it was Barnett who almost kind of discovered him because Jim Barnett was working for Fred Kohler, who was the promoter in Chicago, who had national television. And the Sheik was still sort of bouncing around in Detroit and Toronto and was an undercard wrestler, not really known nationally. And Barnett brought him to Kohler, and they put him on national television, even though he was not a main event attraction, but he got a lot of exposure that way. But then later on, and he was very vocal about this, there's people who said that, who had firsthand accounts of him talking about Barnett in the later years. The Sheik really believed that Barnett was trying to put him out of business during that whole Georgia period. But
he was out of business. So.
Yeah, no, but even before that, even in the late 70s, he felt that Barnett was trying to sabotage him, that he was trying to, that he there were times when he would offer to send them talent from Georgia, and then at the last minute he pulled them out so that they would, the fans would be disappointed that the people that were advertised weren't there. Whether he was being paranoid or not, he did say these things. There's a great book called Drawing Heat by a guy named Jim Friedman. Amazing book. And Jim Friedman went on the road with wrestlers, including the Sheik, in the 80s. And he heard a lot of stories. And he writes in the book directly that the Sheik was still talking about Jim Barnett. He put me out of business. He wanted me out of business and all this stuff. So he really had a bone to pick with Barnett later on in life.
Brian, down to Mr. Briscoe's question about the Sheik. Yeah. It's kind of interesting because it's very similar, it appears, to Skandar Akbar, who helped me significantly, and I rode thousands and thousands of miles with, from Lebanon. Our Lebanese parents, Skandar's parents were, and came over to the United States. Skandar served in the military, same as the Sheik. Now he had to serve because he broke somebody's legs, and that was that or prison. But tell us a little bit about a young Eddie Farhat.
Sure. Well, his parents were from Syria, and it's complicated, all the geopolitics and everything. He was Lebanese, ethnically Lebanese, but at the time it was part of the Ottoman Empire. In those days, they called him Syrian. But he was born here, but and he actually was not a Muslim. He was a Catholic. So there were these sects of Arab Catholics. They were called the Marianites, and they lived in what's now Turkey, Syria, the Middle East, what was the Ottoman Empire. And when the empire fell after World War I, there was an exodus to get out of that country if you were Catholic or if you were Christian. So they came to Lansing, Michigan, which to this day, I think, still has a pretty big Lebanese community. And they were actually known in their community, the family. And that's in the book too, because they had Eddie was the 10th of 11 kids. And he had a lot of brothers, and they all served. Every one of them did something. In fact, the older ones did a little more than him because he was on the younger side. They got all these kind of medals for bravery and things. And they were known in their community. They were known for being this immigrant family that really embraced their new country. They sold war bonds. The daughters, even though, were doing their own things that they could do to support the cause. And Eddie Farhat, the future Sheik, he went over to Europe in World War II, and he saw action. He didn't see, I'm not trying to downplay it because he definitely saw more action than I ever did, but he didn't see a lot of action because by the time he got there, the war in Europe was a couple of months away from being over. But he was in a couple of battles. He drove a tank, and then we're talking about a 19-year-old kid at the time. He drove a tank because he had experience in machinery, because with Detroit and Lansing, he was working on an assembly line, putting cars together. So he knew a lot about that kind of thing. So they put him in a tank, and he saw that service, came back from the war about a year after.
And he actually tried to get in the war a little bit earlier by falsifying documents, right?
He did. So one of the big misconceptions that people always make is he was constantly getting confused with his older brother. So now this makes no sense to me, but his name was Edward Farhat, right? He had a brother who was a year older than him, or 2 years, who was named Edmund Farhat. Why you would do that, I have no idea as a parent why you do that. But they had two Eddie Farhats, and they were very close in age. And he tried to use his older brother's documentation to volunteer. And apparently, I guess he went for the checkup and the whole thing. And once they figured it out, they kicked him out. Because he was 17 years old. But then once he turned 18, then he got drafted. And that's when he went in. But by the time he went through basic training and everything and got sent over, the war was almost over.
Now, was he an athletic guy when he was coming up, or any of his family members athletic guys?
They were. Actually, his brother, he never went to college. So Eddie never went to college, never went to high school, actually.
Never went to high school?
No, he finished. He never went past about 7th or 8th grade, I think. And
phenomenal considering the success that he had, though.
It is. And it's one of those situations where his older brothers, they went a lot further educationally. And I guess part of it was just, but raising that many kids, in a way, it feels like he sort of got, I don't want to say forgotten or anything, but I think by the time they got to that point, maybe they were tired and old as parents, and they weren't putting as much effort into the education and all that. So he never got that far. But his older brother, Ed, who he got confused for, played a lot of college sports. That's why there would be these rumors and urban legends in later years. People would say, well, the Sheik, he was a star football player in college, and he was a coach, and he did this and he did that, and he was but that was his brother. His brother did all that stuff. But he was athletic. He was one of those people in that generation. So many guys got exposed to wrestling thanks to the YMCA. He was one of those people. Actually, Gorilla too. But he got exposed to it there. He wrestled in the Army. He was actually a champion in the European Theater of Operations, the ETO, they called it. The different groups of soldiers would wrestle each other. They would have tournaments and things, especially after the German surrender. They had a lot more free time because he was there for about 9 or 10 months after the surrender. And he won a championship as an amateur wrestler in the Army.
And then when he got out,
he could wrestle when he wanted to.
And then when he got out, what was the progression to get into professional wrestling?
So a lot of people said, which I debunked in the book, but a lot of people said that he debuted as the Sheik. He was already called the Sheik of Araby at the time, and he had the whole persona and everything. Not true. He wrestled for about a year or two just as himself, just as Eddie Farhat from Lansing. And the idea was It's a local boy, you know, made good. He fought in the war. He's a veteran. So he was this hero, you know. It's almost hard to imagine. Good looking young kid. But that didn't draw money, you know. That was kind of vanilla.
And is there any record on who broke him in? The guy Kohler and those guys at the
Yeah, so before Kohler, it was Burt Ruby, and it was Burt Ruby who worked for the Detroit NWA promoter at the time, who was Harry Light, and Burt, who was a founding member of the NWA, and Burt Ruby was sort of like his right hand man, and he promoted a lot of towns, and he discovered talent and things like that, and he got to know him. And there was also Lou Klein, who was a trainer for Sheik, and he was also later on he was one of the Bastien brothers with Red Bastien. But Lou Klein helped to train Sheik and break him in, and between the bunch of those guys, they eventually came up with the Sheik of Araby idea, which was sort of loosely based on his heritage, you know, even though he was not a Muslim like, say, the Iron Sheik was, and some other, I don't know if Skandor Akbar was, but he was using that as part of his, you know, persona to get heat, basically.
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, Skandor was not a very religious guy, and so I don't know what his religious was. You know, he never talked about it. And, yeah, I don't know. I mean, he had a lot of problems being Lebanese growing up in Wichita Falls, Texas, and you know the problems that came with it. That's how he ended up in the military, because got into a heck of a fight and had a choice between prison and the military. So
and same thing there. He had several brothers too that were athletes. So
yeah. So Sheik starts out as a babyface.
Yeah, and there's a picture in the book of him in the newspaper. I mean, it's just wild to see. He's, you know, good-looking kid, clean shaven, you know, nice head of hair. He's probably like 21 years old. Eddie, come down and see our local veteran back from the war, Eddie Farhat. You know, they had him, his first couple of matches were against other guys that were veterans. It was this sort of interesting thing, like other young guys that come back from the war. But after a little while,
this is at Detroit.
Yeah, this was in Lansing, actually, in Lansing, Michigan. There was a small venue there called the Prudent Auditorium, which was like the local wrestling arena for wrestling in Lansing. But when they gave him the Sheik of Araby thing, that's when it really started to take off, and he started going up to Windsor in Ontario, and Harry Light brought him in. They didn't have Cobo Arena yet, but they had the Olympia Stadium there, brought him in there. But he was not a star. That's the thing. He was kind of a mid-card attraction, sort of like an oddity. You know, he would be on these cards that were main evented by people like Lou Thez or Pat O'Connor or even Buddy Rogers and things like that. But he was not the attraction really yet. That took a while. That was partly because of Kohler and national TV, and partly because he bought his own territory. I mean, that's, you know, that helps.
Yeah. Another thing about him, Brian, as you're talking there, you know, in the business, you make a lot of friends. And then, you know, you said he was on the card with O'Connor and Rogers and all these. These guys didn't really seem to befriend him in the beginning. He just seemed to be kind of a guy on his own, and that's what makes his success even more intriguing to me.
Yeah, there's a story about him and Thez. And I mean, it should be of no surprise to anybody that Lou Thez wasn't incredibly thrilled about this guy bowing to Mecca and making all these weird noises and not, you know, really being what he would consider to be a true wrestler, being more of a cartoon. And there was a story, and this actually wound up helping Sheik, where they gave the Sheik a shot at Lou Thez, and I think it was in Chicago. And so it basically Thez, the Sheik felt, they talked backstage, and Lou said something to him to the effect of, you know, if you try to pull any of your shit, I'm going to break your arm or your leg or something. So, you know, don't do all that goofy stuff when we're in there, which Sheik completely ignored when they got in the ring. And Thez apparently got mad. And when Sheik realized that he was in a lot of trouble, which he was, he fled the ring. This was reported in newspapers. So he's, you know, in character, the whole, didn't break anything, fled the ring, went out. There had been a snowstorm, went out into the snow, and he hid under a bus that was parked there in the snow. And they had to call the police to come and sort it out. Of course, he lost the match by count out, needless to say. But this got picked up by national press. And apparently even Thez was impressed to the fact of like, well, he brought more attention to me by doing this, and he brought more attention to the match. And this put him on the radar of a lot of promoters. Doing such a crazy stunt like that, actually helped his career.
I've heard about this stunt running and hiding under the bus. Why did he run all the way outside and hide under the bus? Was Thez chasing him?
Yes.
So Thez was chasing him.
He chased him out of the ring. I don't know if he chased him out of the building, but whatever it was.
But he obviously thought he was in enough danger. He went outside in the snow and hid under the bus.
In the snow, and you have to imagine he's probably got no shirt on. He's in his wrestling gear. Wow. In the snow under a bus. And this is not one of those tall tales. This was reported on by newspaper, accounts. It got picked up nationally. And, the match got thrown out, of course. And it wound up being like, well, who is this guy? Did you hear about this crazy Sheik? He ran into the snow. He hid under a bus. So it's kind of crazy, like a fox in a way, because he made himself into this unpredictable person that you wanted to see. What's he going to do?
Now, Brian, during the Sheik's beginning years, national TV, Dumont Network, all those TVs are starting to pop. Now, here's a young kid, and he made his, I wouldn't say debut, because how long had he been in the business before he finally started latching onto those national promotions? And he must have been quite a good head to be able to get booked on those national promotions, because they weren't just putting anybody on those things.
Yeah, he was wrestling probably, and including the pre-Sheik years. He'd been probably wrestling about 6 or 7 years by the time he got on national TV. In fact, some of those broadcasts are still around. They were well preserved. Some of that stuff, like the Chicago International Amphitheater and the Marigold Arena, and you could see some of those. And it's actually surprising because he does all the kind of weird Sheik stuff, but once the bell rings, he's wrestling. He's actually going hold for hold, doing things that he certainly wouldn't do later on. But he got, he was on national TV for a little while with Chicago.
He had to have all kinds of heat with that Sheik gimmick. Was he the Sheik when he debuted on national TV?
Yes, he was already the Sheik, and not all the pieces of the puzzle were there yet. Over time, he started developing things like the prayer mat, bowing to Mecca, and throwing fire and all that stuff. He had his wife. This is before he had Abdullah Farouk, the Grand Wizard, and guys like that with him. He had his wife Joyce, who he dressed up as the slave girl, with her face covered and her whole body and everything, and she was his valet, and he would kind of like abuse her and treat her poorly and yell at her, and sometimes he'd put her in front of him, to protect himself. In fact, I even got told by Lanny Poffo, who I interviewed at the time for the book. Lanny said that he and his brother Randy, they got some of their earliest starts wrestling for the Sheik in the 70s, and Randy had said himself that he picked up some of the stuff that he would do with Elizabeth. He, as his valet, he picked up from the Sheik and the slave girl of sort of like getting heat by treating her badly and hiding behind her. He got a lot of that stuff from Sheik, but Sheik did that for a couple of years with his wife, and then he actually spent a couple of years working for Vince Sr. in Capital Wrestling in the Northeast, and that helped get him a lot of exposure. And then he bought his own territory.
Where
now,
did Sheik
was he considered a national star? Was his ability on par with the Thezes and the other guys that were making their debuts on national TV?
Well, I would say, I mean, his wrestling ability was not, and I think he'd be the first to say that, but his drawing ability eventually, I would say, I don't want to get struck by lightning, but it exceeded people like Thez. I mean, there were a couple of years where in the late 60s, early 70s, where it was he was the hottest, at least number one or number two at the least, attraction in the entire business. He had a couple of years like that, you know.
Brian, where did Sheik get this? Where did he learn this from? I mean, you didn't have a lot of heels. I mean, real heels. You had heels as far back as 1900. Yusuf Ismail was probably the first, great heel, the Terrible Turk.
Yeah.
And you had a few after that, but not really huge heels. Obviously Buddy Rogers comes along, Gorgeous George comes along, but you didn't have a template really for what heels like now you have one. Where did Sheik get a lot of this from? Was he just a smart guy? Did he have a good perception? Did he have mentors that were helping him with this?
I think he had a perception for what was working, So, like I was saying, he didn't just immediately come out doing all these things. It started out as more or less just a costume that he wore. I mean, in the beginning, it really wasn't much more than that. And as he started to see the heat that it was getting, he started leaning into it more and more. In fact, there's a story in the book where actually some of the input he was getting, and this is even in the Chicago years where they were national, was coming from the TV production people, where he had cameramen or directors and things that were saying to him, hey, listen, when you do that little dance that you do, people seem to really respond to that. Do more of that. Maybe look up at the ceiling like you're looking to Allah or something like that, and do all this and let us know where you're going to be when you do it. So they were already thinking like that. Like you even see in WWE of today is, well, make sure you do it near the camera. And if you let me know where you're going to be, I'll make sure I have a camera right in your face while you're drooling and your eyes are rolling up in your head and all this. So he was ahead of his time in a lot of that, and thinking about character, and thinking also, I'm a limited wrestler. There's only so much I can do. I'm not going to dazzle you, but if I can lean into character work, if I can lean into the mystery of the persona, or doing these things that will make you angry, I could make up for all that. You're not going to notice. You're not going to notice all that, because you're going to be too busy wanting to kill me, and he really leaned into that.
Where did all the kayfabing start? Sheik did not speak Arabic, from what I understand.
Very little, yeah.
But he would not speak English either. He would kayfabe. Wouldn't let people call him Ed. It was real big.
Right.
On that. When did all that start? Which you saw a lot of that with a lot of the great performers. Abdullah was the same way. He learned a lot from the Sheik. But the great performers were, especially during that time, were like that. When did he start adopting that?
Well, somebody told me that if you called his house and asked for Eddie Farhat, he would say he's not home and hang up with you, or he doesn't live here, hang up on you. People had to call him Sheik. At his funeral, the priest called him Sheik. the priest, he mentioned Edward Farhat one time, and the rest of the service, it was just Sheik. So, and again, that was something that developed over time. I think I had to sort of demystify it a little bit, because there are people, and this is the greatest credit to him, there are people out there who to this day, or at least before the book came out, thought that this is the way he lived his life 24/7. When he went home at night, he was the Sheik. When he was in the locker room, he was the Sheik. And all, he was, and I had to sort of point out, well, look, let's look at this realistically. How could he couldn't live his life that way. He wasn't chewing up the curtains in his house. He wasn't, he had to pay people. He ran a promotion. He wasn't, throwing fire in people's faces. So basically the idea, his approach to it was this. If he was anywhere in public where anybody could see him that wasn't smart to the business or wasn't in his family or anything, he was going to be the Sheik 100%. That meant if he was at a restaurant, if he was at a gas station, Joyce would pay for the gas. If they were at restaurants, Joyce would order the food. When they went on the road, a lot of times when he went to Japan, he brought her with him, because he didn't want to break that kayfabe, and so she would have to deal directly, especially because in Japan they believed it even more, even than here, to the point where even a lot of the other wrestlers and promoters believed it, and he didn't want to spoil that, because he had this belief, maybe true back in those days, that if people knew all the truth, that would affect his bottom line. If they knew in those days, well, this guy, he's a World War II vet, he's Catholic, he grew up in Lansing, he speaks perfect English. that if they knew that in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, not so much today, but if they knew that then, that would really hurt his ability to draw money. So he went to the hilt. You know, people who worked with him said, of course, the minute he came through the curtain in the locker room, he was Eddie Farhat. Even if you called him Sheik, he was Eddie Farhat. But once he came through and he was in that arena, there was no blinking ever at any time. None.
And so he just kind of coincided with the birth of television, same as Gorgeous George and Buddy Rogers, the same thing. During but he bought the territory, what, in 54? Was that right, or 64?
No, he bought it in 64.
64. So during that time, before that, that's when he's developing the entire Sheik character. And was he mainly based out of Detroit and Chicago during that time?
So by the early 60s, he was starting to branch out. I think he was starting to become a draw in California. He was really big in the San Francisco territory, in the LA territory. He would come in and he got big. Chicago. He was actually very big in Texas. That was another thing. When he went down to Amarillo and Lubbock in sort of the very end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, that was the first place he ever main evented consistently, was in Amarillo and Lubbock.
That's the reason that later on the Funks came back and paid him back?
Absolutely. They loved him. I think even after he did what he did, they still loved him. I mean, there was just a connection because he had worked for their dad. He had drawn a lot of money for their dad, also for Nick Roberts, who was the promoter in Lubbock. He was main eventing regularly there against Dory Sr., Dory Jr. I think Terry in those days was a little too young, but he was drawing a lot of money there. And then he was starting to get that name recognition where he was one of those guys that could tour and go everywhere he wanted and make money everywhere. Detroit, obviously. But by the time when he bought the promotion, he was already a good, solid main event draw attraction. But at that point, when he bought it, that's when it really went to a whole other level.
Well, let's back up just a hair. During the 50s, there you mentioned, he was traveling, and he made the move out to Capital Wrestling, which was Vince McMahon Sr. How was that run out there, and how did that top off?
So he was there full time for about a year and a half, like 59 to 60, somewhere in there.
How did he get there? Was it just through his fame from other territories, or
at that time in the late 50s, early 60s, Fred Kohler in Chicago was working very closely with Vince Sr. They were partners. In fact, the big Buddy Rogers, Pat O'Connor thing at Comiskey Park, that was a co-promotion between Kohler and Vince McMahon. Vince McMahon Sr. was there. Vince McMahon Jr. was there, believe it or not. He told me that himself, 16 years old.
I didn't know that. And I didn't know it was a promotion with Vince McMahon Sr. I knew it was Kohler.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's awesome.
It's really interesting.
You see it now in Buddy Rogers' interview.
Yes.
Interview after that famous interview, but it couldn't happen to a nicer guy. It's one of the greatest interviews of all time, but you see the influence of Vince McMahon Sr. I don't know if Vince McMahon Sr. had anything to do with it, but that's the type of thing that Vince McMahon Sr. loved.
I think he did. And actually, once Buddy wins the NWA world title, he started going more and more to New York. It was almost like they kind of pulled him over to the point where all the NWA promoters were getting pissed off because they weren't getting their dates on him. He was always in the Northeast. And that came from Vince Sr. working with Fred Kohler, but there were other talents that got funneled through there, and one of them was the Sheik. He basically transitioned from wrestling in the Chicago, Detroit area to being full-time in New York. But again, at that point, he was not a main event guy. 59, 60, that was the Antonino Rocca years and Miguel Perez and the Grahams. And actually, at that time, he was mainly a tag team guy. When he was in Capitol, they had him as a full-time tag team with Wild Bull Curry, and talk about an insane tag team. And they actually had a couple of main events at the Garden against Rocca and Perez, but he was pretty much considered a tag team wrestler in New York at that time. He came back years later when Bruno was champion, and it's night and day. At that point, he was like a supervillain, and they sold out all over the territory. But it took a few years to get there.
You mentioned Antonino Rocca and the Grahams and some of the stars of that era. Where did other guys fit in? I mean, talking about the 50s specifically, just for reference for me and for anybody watching this or listening to it. Where did guys like Fez fit in? Where did Buddy Rogers? Where did Gorgeous George? What were the main stars and what were the main touring stars, say, of the 50s?
There's no question in the 50s that the Sheik was not at that level. He was. There might be some revisionist history that he was. I mean, later on, he got to that level, but not in the 50s. In the 50s, Gorgeous George, Rocca, it was like, you had Gorgeous George on the West Coast, you had Rocca on the East Coast. They were considered kind of equivalent in drawing power. The weird thing was the one and only time Gorgeous George ever came to the Garden, it was a disaster. They just couldn't draw.
Yeah.
But and then Rocca kind of filled that void. Fez was a draw, but the thing about it was, and I think this is partly why Fez never had a lot of nice things to say about Rocca, let's say. He never had a lot of nice things to say about Buddy Rogers. And I think part of that was because even though Fez was the world champion, there were certain places where he would go, like New York, where he wasn't a huge draw, but they were. He would go to New York, and sometimes he wouldn't even be on top, even as the world champion, because New York was this weird territory where in those days, and I think this is before Bruno, the Athletic Commission didn't allow you to advertise a world champion because they had classified wrestling as an exhibition. So even if you were the world champion, they couldn't call you that. You couldn't wear the belt. It was very strange. So for whatever reason, Fez was not a huge success in New York like he was in other places, but still, New York aside, he was one of the biggest draws of the 50s. I mean, he was the world champion almost through the entire decade. So you had Fez, you had Rocca, you had Gorgeous George. Those were probably the three biggest stars of that era in terms of drawing power.
As we're moving along here, he makes his move out to New York, and how did that end? Did that end on a friendly note with Vince Senior? How did that end?
It did, because they basically he was there a couple of years. And this was at a time when he was starting a family, so it couldn't have been that easy. And I think there was a temptation to want to go back to the Detroit area and base your operations there. And that's what he wound up doing. He had the ability to really settle down. But the thing about him, once he bought the territory there, like a lot of wrestlers that did that, like Vern Gagne did that, he bought the territory, or, other people. Eddie Graham is a good example. These were guys that were major stars, national stars. But once Fritz von Erich's a good one too. Once they bought the territory, they kind of just stayed there. They kind of hunkered down. They stopped going around. But Sheik didn't do that. He was different. He bought the territory in '64, and yeah, he was in Detroit a huge amount of the time. But he would take these tours where he would still go to New York. He'd go to California. He'd go to Texas. He'd go, to the Maple Leaf Gardens, and eventually he'd go to Japan. All these things. So he was still making a lot of money as an attraction, while also running his own territory at the same time. So he was kind of having the best of both worlds for a few years there.
Yeah, he bought the territory from Johnny Doyle and Jim Barnett, and Jim Barnett keep popping up in the Sheik's history, quite relevant all through it there. What kind of friendship did they have, and what kind of shape was the territory in at the time? I know Barnett. He wouldn't walk away from a gold mine, but he'd walk away from a money pit. So,
Barnett and Doyle, they were, I guess, in those days, what would have been considered an outlaw, because
they were the Vince McMahon of their era, right?
Yeah, they were not NWA members. So like I mentioned Harry Light before. Harry Light was the officially recognized NWA promoter for the Detroit area, and they basically went to war with him, and they wound up. Doyle and Barnett were not NWA members. and they had a lot of success. They got it on TV for the first time. They were the first ones in Detroit to call it Big Time Wrestling, which was the name that the Sheik adopted. But when the Sheik bought them out, he became an NWA member, which I guess was a good move because he was able to get a lot of talent that way, and he didn't have to worry about, fighting a promotional war.
That's kind of surprising to me, Brian, because he just left New York and had that relationship with
Yeah.
Vince. But Vince was actually an NWA member at that time, too.
At that time, Vince still was. Yeah, he didn't pull out until 63 with Bruno and all that. But the Sheik decided to be an NWA member. It was not because the territory was doing badly. I mean, there was, Jim Barnett had reasons to want to leave the country at that time. There were things going on that would make him want to be on the other side of the planet in terms of, and it's in the book. There were
Kentucky.
Yeah, there was a scandal going on with him, and I can go into the details. It's in the book where,
Tell us a little bit about the scandal.
Mr. Briscoe worked for this man. I'm afraid to besmirch him too much.
Please be honest.
So apparently, Jim Barnett was a gay man, and was flamboyantly so. Was not afraid to hide this fact, but he did some bad things. He was involved with at that time there were it was not a time where you could be publicly gay, and he was friends with some other people that were in the same boat. Rock Hudson was another one. Him and Rock Hudson were good friends, the actor, the Hollywood actor.
Really? See, that's good tidbit.
Yep. They were good friends. But Jim Barnett would host these parties, which, hey, more live and let live. But it becomes an issue when you have the entire football team of the University of Kentucky at these parties, and he's introducing them to people like Rock Hudson.
Football players are strange, man.
And some of them I don't.
Why?
I don't think some of those guys knew what they were getting into when they were being invited to these parties.
There's probably a lot of them did. Those are
maybe some of them did, but it became a really, and we're talking 1964, 63. So it was a huge scandal, and Barnett wanted to leave the country. And I think if he could have gone to Mars, he would have opened up a promotion there.
What was the scandal? Was it all because of the football team and the parties and
right? They considered it like he was
got a little wild, John.
Well, right. I know they did, but I'm wondering how he got stooged. I wonder what happened.
John, I could draw you a picture if you want.
No, I don't need pictures. I can guess what happened.
Google it, John. Google. We can't expose our fans to this guy.
They considered that he was corrupting these young men. That was what was happening at the time, and also because I think he was because these were amateur athletes, and he was buying things for them and giving them cars.
Back in those days, John, he was buying cars for these football players.
Really?
Yeah.
That was back in when amateurism was strict amateurism.
Right. And then I guess there maybe was an understanding that there would be things expected in return for these things that they were getting. And so, he was in a hurry to sell. And Johnny Doyle, who at that time was
he's in a hurry to sell because he wanted to get out of the country.
Right.
Straight guy, was Johnny Doyle straight, or was Johnny Doyle like them?
Yeah. No, Johnny Doyle was straight. Johnny Doyle was also, I believe, a lot older than Jim because he had been a promoter going way back to the 30s and 40s. And I think he was just kind of going along, sort of like, well, if you're going to Australia, I guess I'm going to go to Australia too. And, he was also, I don't think Johnny Doyle was in great health.
Did they take the football team with them to Australia?
Maybe he branched into soccer when he was out there. I don't know. But apparently they sold it cheap. I think it was something in the tens of thousands of dollars.
Well, now does Sheik know that Barnett's trying to get out of the country? Was it kind of well known back then, behind closed doors?
I
have to imagine that he did, because this was being reported on. This was in the news. So
national news.
He's not dumb. And I knew a guy that I interviewed for the book. He was a photographer, but he was a young kid at the time. He was sort of like down on his luck kid that the Doyle family, Johnny and his wife, had taken in, and he was kind of living there for a little while. and he was there on the day that Sheik and Joyce came to Johnny Doyle's apartment. Barnett was already out of the country. He was gone. He was already in Australia, and Johnny Doyle was handling all the loose ends. He was in the apartment when the deal was made, and he talked about Sheik being there and signing the papers and how happy he was and all that stuff. I think it was maybe like 30 grand or something like that. And he went into a deal where Sheik was partners with his father-in-law, Francis Flesser, who was sort of like the Jack Tunney of big time wrestling. Francis Flesser became the figurehead president, and in those days, people thought he was the promoter because Sheik couldn't put himself out there as being the promoter. You know, that would kind of like ruin things. So he went into partnership with his father-in-law. They made a down payment on the thing, and they bought the territory. And then Johnny Doyle went over to Australia, and he didn't live much longer. He only lived a couple more years after that. And I guess Barnett, after about 10 years, felt like it was safe to come back. And then he came back to Georgia.
What year did Barnett come back?
When Sheik bought the territory, what was their TV like? Were they still on a national TV, or was it down to syndication local TVs at that time?
Yeah, so by 64, there was no more national wrestling TV. That was done. That was done by about 56 or so. And that's when this was the heyday of local regionalized wrestling on TV. You know, you live in a certain area, you watch your wrestling, you don't really know what's happening anywhere else, right? And so the TV had already been established by Barnett and Doyle. In fact, that was part of what Sheik bought. He bought those TV contracts. He bought the arena contracts and things like that. They didn't have contracts for the wrestlers in those days, but whatever wrestlers had agreed to work for Barnett and Doyle, he got those people. And so he inherited the TV, and they were on TV. They were on TV, but it was pretty good area. I mean, it wasn't national, but they were on throughout Michigan. They were on in Southern Ontario, Windsor area like that. They were on in Ohio. So, and he inherited all that. He didn't have to build that. He certainly built it up from where it was where he got it, but they were already on TV.
Okay, one more question about the football team. What year?
Man.
What year did
Layfield on that Kentucky team?
Wait, no. What year did Barnett come back?
You're asking
10 years. Do you know? Remember what year it was?
I think it was.
The reason I'm asking, it's not a trick.
Well, Mr. Brisco, you know better than I would know, right?
I'm trying to put that.
The reason I ask is J. Edgar Hoover died in 72. And I just did Barnett, how high did it go?
71, 70, 74, around 74, John, when he came back.
So it's after Hoover died.
And that's approximately the day,
yeah.
75.
And the reason I say that, Brian, is because the Freedom of Information Act, Mr. Brisco used to always ask Pat Patterson, so Pat, why don't you ever go to a gay bar or anything to hang out, like at a karaoke or stuff? And Pat used to always say, because they're following me. And Jerry always thought he was just being paranoid. Well, the Freedom of Information Act, J. Edgar Hoover had a file on Pat Patterson.
Yeah.
For no reason other than the fact that he was gay. And he tried to trick him into going back to Montreal, and he was going to keep him out of the country. J. Edgar Hoover was just a piece of shit, a horrible human being. And that's why I just wonder if this thing with Barnett, how high did it get? Because with Pat, it got all the way to J. Edgar Hoover.
Well, Hoover that was one of his pet projects for years. He had and a lot of people have speculated it's because he might have been gay himself, or there were certain things.
Was he was a cross-dresser. I don't know if
cross-dresser.
That's the rumor, yeah.
And so he really had a chip on his shoulder about that. Basically, once Prohibition ended and he didn't have that to deal with anymore, and once the mob was under control, that was his number one thing. He really had a thing for that. And it wouldn't surprise me that those two things would coincide. But another thing you got to remember is when Barnett went to Australia, it wasn't like he was just hiding there. I mean, he created his promotion there, which was the original World Championship Wrestling. That's what he called it. And even though it was Australia, New Zealand, and people in America, North America, had no idea, meaning fans and things, that it even existed, it was one of, if not the most successful promotions on the planet. I mean, he was making a lot of money over there. So it was hard to leave. I don't think it's something that he was in a big hurry to leave, but I think once he realized he could come back, then eventually he did come back. But also he was doing pretty well down there.
Yeah, Jerry worked for him down there a couple times.
Yeah, I spent a year down there. I mean, he did doing New Zealand, doing Australia. Then we go up to the Orient there, do Singapore, Bangkok, and Hong Kong, and all those islands up in the Asia, Malaysia area there. So
I was just curious.
He had a huge territory for that day.
That covers a lot of ground. I mean, Australia itself is gigantic.
TV was ever. Jim was after he was with Vince for Junior so long, because his TV connection. Jim had that TV connection all over the world. It wasn't just the United States. I mean, he was deeply embedded in these guys all over the world with TVs.
Yeah, I was just curious because the thing with Pat, when all that came out, it was so crazy to hear that Jay. It got all the way to J. Edgar Hoover about Pat. I just wondered, Barnett had to leave, obviously, for different. Pat was just gay. Jim may have had some problems with
there may have been a legitimate.
There may have been some issues with Jim Barnett.
Kentucky football player. Let's move on to wrestling.
Yeah.
John's worried that one of his relatives, Layfield, showed up on that Kentucky football team.
But the thing with Pat, though, when he did his book, when Pat did his book with Bertrand Hébert, I think, I could be mistaken on this, that they actually proved that was true. They actually found the paperwork, like you were saying, freedom of information.
That's right, they did. It's all true. I've read it. Me and Mr. Brisco read. We had Dave Bixenspan on, who did a lot of research on it, and we read all of the stuff that was a file on J. Edgar Hoover on Pat Patterson for no reason other than the fact that he was gay. I mean, there was nothing. He did nothing wrong.
A threat, Pat Patterson, a threat to democracy.
Yeah. Hey, I'll tell you a funny story. Pat called me and when his book came out, and he goes, my book's coming out. I said, oh, great, Pat. I said, can't wait to read it. He goes, well, I got big news in it. And I said, what is it? He goes, well, I'm coming out. I said, a what? And he said, the closet. And he goes, I'm gay. I go, Pat, everybody knows you're gay. And he goes, no, they don't. I said, Pat, I set you up on a date in New York with a guy, a really nice guy. You dated him for a while. I said, I obviously know you're gay. He goes, oh, yeah. Yeah, that's right. Okay, but not everybody else knows. So,
yeah, remember when he was on the show Legends House? That really got me, because I understand they want to do something special for TV, and I'm not trying to take away. It was an emotional moment, but for him, when he came out on that show, I remember thinking, like, well, is there anybody that doesn't know this?
That's right.
It's like the Legends House.
On the
that's right, especially with the old guys.
I kind of thought, well, I mean, I guess maybe casual fans or people that aren't following it that closely, but I feel like that's one of the biggest open secrets, of all time. But
Well, going up and down the highway with Pat all the time, Bruce, JR, myself, and Pat. Pat, why don't you I don't want to let these kids down. I said, Pat, you're the only one in the business that don't think you're gay. And he was. Everybody knew it, but Pat would, he did his best to just stay away from it. That's the reason why all these guys, Pat did it. I don't believe 99% of them. Maybe 1% that happened to, but there's too many of them. I've seen Pat in too many situations. I've never seen anything like that going on.
Well, yeah, certainly. I haven't either. I was glad I saw some document where they're talking about, one of the scandals, and one of the guys that said, well, Pat Patterson wasn't involved, and I was glad somebody said that, because I don't know what was and didn't happen, but my inside tells me that.
Anyway, John, could we get back off of Kentucky football players and get back on?
Well, we're talking about Sheik buying the damn territory from Jim Barnett, because Jim Barnett had to go to Australia.
Well, there's one thing.
Damn reason.
I know.
You're the one that just brought it. You're the one that just brought the damn road trip with Pat. You bring up a road trip with Pat, then I tell a story. Okay, we can go back and talk about something else other than Pat.
Well, one thing I have, I know this is still on Pat, but one thing I remember from when I worked at WWE, because I think unfortunately he got lumped in a lot, because there was a time when people would have that prejudice where they just thought, well, if you're gay, then you must be some type of a deviant doing all these things. So people thought it would be easy to believe if they made up things about you. I remember because when superstar Billy Graham got brought back into the good graces of the company, I was at the TV in Baltimore when they invited him back to meet everybody. This is like when his book was coming out and his DVD. And I very much remember that Pat refused to meet with him or talk to him or anything. He was the only one. And as loyal as he was to Vince, even he said, I'm not going to do this, because I guess he still blamed the superstar for being one of those people who made up things about him and dragged his name through the mud. And he refused to bury the hatchet, would not
Why
talk.
that went on forever. I mean, up until basically up until Superstar's death. I mean,
Yeah.
Billy would, when he moved out to Phoenix, Billy would come to the arenas, and everybody would go over and sit with Billy and talk to him, and rightfully so, and gain some of his knowledge. Everybody except for Pat. Pat, I don't like the guy in the building. He gives me the creep for being in the building. I mean, that it was that type of a relationship with those two guys, which is sad because they were both phenomenal performers at our business.
And tag team partners. I mean, they did a lot together. Even they were, but
so getting back to Barnett fled the country.
Thank you, John.
Barnett fled the country. and Sheik probably knew that there was some problem, right? So that's one of the reasons he was able to get the territory from him, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that he would have known. I just think it was one of those things that was not a secret of why he was leaving the country, and it might have helped him get a good deal on it. Who knows? I mean, because even for 1964,
$30,000,
right? That doesn't sound like a lot to ask for what was already a very successful promotion that you're basically just being handed.
Well, I paid that for part of my percentages, a minor part of my percentages for Georgia and Florida.
Right. And also the other thing was he only bought half of his territory. So the actual original Barnett and Doyle territory was bigger, and it had the northern part, which was the Detroit area, and it went down into Indianapolis. And basically what happened there was they got forced out. So Dick the Bruiser, Wilbur Snyder, they started up what was the WWA, which was another outlaw, and they didn't buy a thing. They didn't buy anything. They just came in there and started running. And the Sheik, in the tradition of the time for the business, he went about it, quote unquote, the right way, but he only got half of it. And the other half was Dick the Bruiser's. And then when Dick the Bruiser wanted to take the whole thing, then that created a massive promotional war in Detroit because he started coming in and running opposition.
That's great. Let's take us really deep into that. Dick the Bruiser's war with the Sheik, and these two had been partners, not probably business partners, the way I understand, but partners in the ring and help establish Detroit as one of the major deals. Bruiser was one of the Sheik's first big superstars there, correct? And then they get that promotion war. How did that friendship dissolve into that?
Well, in the beginning, Dick the Bruiser actually had a much quicker rise in the business. He had been a star football player.
Football player, John.
Not University of Kentucky, though. But he was a very big deal almost from the minute he walked into the business. It wasn't like the Sheik. The Sheik had to spend years building himself up. Bruiser was almost immediately a big star. And so he had even been a star for Barnett and Doyle, an even bigger star than Sheik was at that time. And when he basically took over for Barnett and Doyle in Indianapolis, I think that's sort of when the friendship or whatever kind of professional, respect there was between him and the Sheik went out the window, because he initially was trying to take it over almost from the beginning. He came into Detroit initially in 64, 65, right after the Sheik took over. He ran a couple of shows and then he left. But then when he came back again in the early 70s, it went on for years. I mean, there were years where on a Saturday night in Detroit, you could say, am I going to go to Olympia Stadium and see Dick the Bruiser and his guys, or am I going to go to Cobo that same night on the other side of town and see the Sheik and his guys? And that's how hot it got, where they were just running on the same nights in the same city for a long time.
And how were they both doing?
Well, the thing about it was, the Sheik really was never on the losing end of this. So it never was a situation like, let's say, WWF and WCW, where there was a period where they traded places and all of a sudden WCW is winning and all this. That never quite happened with the Bruiser. It was close. But one of the reasons that the Bruiser still never left was he had support and he had money and he had people bankrolling him. So there was a promoter. The Sheik was running Cobo Arena. He wasn't running Olympia. There was a promoter who was just the event promoter at Olympia. His name was Lincoln Cavalieri, and he wanted in on wrestling. And he bankrolled the Bruiser to come in there, and he had a lot of money to spend. They were competitive. You know, you'd have a situation where he was definitely taking fans away from the Sheik, no question, because Cobo Arena had a capacity of 12,500 people for wrestling.
And
So
what was the NWA's stats during this battle?
well, this is another reason why it was good that Sheik was a member, because part of the reason why the Sheik was maintaining a lead throughout all this was the NWA was sending in everything but the kitchen sink. So that's why if you were a fan in those days, it was a great time. You'd go down there and you'd see national stars from all over the place show up. You know, Bruno might be there, or the Funks might come in, or Dusty, or Mil Mascaras, and Andre the Giant, and all these people were coming in on these mega shows. You'd have 13, 14 matches. There were so many people on the card to accommodate. And so you'd have a situation where Kobo might have 12,000 people in it, and then Olympia would have 10,000 people the same night. So, I mean, it was close, but the Sheik was always slightly in the lead.
And what was the end sum game for Bruiser? Did he think he was going to take over the territory, get the TV? Was it a zero sum game? They weren't ever trying to work together. They're both trying to put the other guy out of business, right?
Absolutely, because he had that attitude of, well, I didn't have to buy Indianapolis, so I just took it. So I'm going to do the same thing with Detroit. I'm going to just go in there and take it. And he also, Dick the Bruiser, was working with Vern Gagne, because the AWA and the WWA had that kind of working relationship. They shared Chicago. They co-promoted Chicago. And so I think what ended it was the Sheik started buying up TV time. And it's crazy how he wouldn't think of doing this sooner, but he started buying up TV time in some of the AWA territories and in Indianapolis. He started getting himself on TV there. And basically Vern Gagne went to Dick the Bruiser and said, you guys need to sort this out, because I'm not having this television on in my markets. So you got to figure this out one way or the other. And Sheik reached out to Bruiser reached out to Sheik and said, you know, you can't do this. To which the Sheik, of course, responded, well, you know, obviously you're one to talk. I can't do this. I can't run TV in your areas, but you could come into my area and run, you know, in my area. So they basically made this mutual agreement. I'll pull out my TV in Chicago, in Indianapolis, and these other places if you stop running in my backyard. And they worked it out, and they wound up turning it into like what happens a lot, like what happened in Memphis with the Pafos. You know, they turn it into a storyline where, okay, all the fans know Bruiser's been in Detroit running for years. Well, guess what? Come down to Cobo Hall next week. It's going to be the Sheik versus Dick the Bruiser. We're going to settle this once and for all. And we're going to do it at Cobo and Olympia, right?
Wow. Tremendous.
But people didn't realize at that point the war was over in reality. I mean, then the Bruiser came in, and they had such gigantic egos. I have it in the book where I listed all their main events all throughout both territories. Not a single winner in any match. Not one time. Not once did any guy pin the other guy. Not a single time.
Those old bastards had the biggest egos.
Was Sheik the actual matchmaker and booker? Did he take care of the finishes in his territory, or did he have somebody working with him on that department?
He did in the early years in the 60s. I wish I had it in front of me. He had a guy who was an in-law in the Funk family. I can't remember his name. You might know. He had been
Herman Gus.
No, not him. There was somebody who was a brother-in-law of Dory Senior or something like
Jack
that.
Funk.
No, you're gonna make me look it up at some point. But he brought this guy in, and he was his booker in the 60s, and then at a certain point he started running opposition to him. This would happen to the Sheik a lot, which tells me that a lot of people did not like him. He would have people that were loyal to him, and then all of a sudden they were running opposition. So this guy, he went with the opposition for a while, and then the Sheik brought in Tom Renesto to be his booker for a little while. And then I think he even had Dory Jr. as booking for him for a little while. And then his true downfall in the later years, not to speak ill of the dead, but he had his son booking for him, which was a cardinal mistake. Eddie Jr., who didn't really have a lot of respect from the boys. And here he is now. Zero. Okay.
Not a lot, but he had zero respect from the town.
And here he is
So that's
now
not
sitting.
a lot.
Right. That's pretty low. And now, but he's the guy who's coming in there and going, okay, guys, here's what you're going to do tonight. And here's who's going over. And they're thinking, why are we listening to this guy for, And that was the downfall. But in the beginning, so the Sheik never really, he would book his own programs, but most of the stuff he handed over to other people to do for him.
And the Sheik ended up at one time having to leave Inoki's tour to come back because the war was heating up, right?
Yeah. So he started going to Japan in the early 70s, and he would never stay as long as a lot of guys would. Most guys would go there for 6-8 weeks. They'd be there for months. And he would only go for about 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And it was because he was so paranoid of what was going to happen while he was gone, especially if he was taking Joyce with him. Because, then who's minding the store? And at one time, his worst fears came true. And it was because he really only mainly worked for Baba. He was one of those American guys that were loyal to Baba, like Bruno was like that, and Gorilla Monsoon was like that. And the one time that he went to work for Inoki, the one and only time, is when it happened. When he left, they were waiting for him to leave. It was his booker. It was some of his top stars, Mark Lewin, Killer Brooks, even Dave Brzezinski, who's a good friend of mine who worked in the front office and who later became one of the Sheik's managers. Even he went over. The ring announcer went. All these people went. They were just waiting. And when the Sheik got wind of it, he had to cancel the Inoki tour in the middle, go home. And by the way, he and Inoki never worked together again. Inoki was not happy about this. He didn't care what was going on there. He had to immediately go home and take care of business and figure out what was going on. But like what always happened with those guys, it's wild to me. You see these things happen, and then they all go back to working together again like nothing happened,
Which, by the way, I was reading on the internet, which has to be true because it's on the internet.
Of course.
That Abe Lincoln said that if it's on the internet, it's got to be true. I read that on the internet. It's got to be true. That Sheik trained Muhammad Ali against Inoki.
We can put air quotes around the trained, but yes. So
what happened? Because there was no training. He got there and it was a shoot, which was the problem.
Right. So when that happened with Inoki and they were doing the big promotion with Antonio Inoki and Muhammad Ali, that was something that was spearheaded by the McMahons, actually, and in fact that was one of the first really big moves that Vince Jr. had made. Even when he was working for his father, he got together with Bob Arum, the boxing promoter, and they were working on this thing. And basically, because the WWF at that time was back in the NWA, a lot of people forget that in the 70s they were a member again of the NWA. So all the promoters got together and said, this could be really good for us. We'll co-promote it across the board, all the territories, and we'll do this closed circuit thing, because what they did in Shea Stadium was only one of many shows that were going on all over the country. We'll do the closed circuit, Inoki Ali, we'll have live matches. And so all the promoters had a part to play. And the part that Sheik played, don't ask me why, of all the people. Actually, I do know why. There's a reason why. Ali had a training camp that was near, maybe 50 miles out or something, to Detroit. he had a ranch and a training camp. And so they felt like, well, who's the closest NWA promoter to this camp? Oh, it's Sheik. It's Eddie Farhat. Okay. So they sent him down to the camp to be supposedly the Sheik's trainer. And I'm sorry, Ali's trainer. And there's a great story that I found in the newspaper where the Sheik shows up in the limo and the whole thing with his entourage at Ali's training camp. He gets out of the car in full, with the suit and the headdress and the tie and the vest. And I guess Ali had a cook or a maid or something who was a huge wrestling fan, completely, not smart to the business, obviously, huge wrestling fan. She sees the Sheik come out of the car and goes into a fit, don't hurt my boy, talking about Muhammad Ali, I love this boy. This is my boy. This is my friend. Don't touch him. Don't hurt him. Don't throw fire at him. And she made a whole scene thinking that the Sheik was going to attack her beloved, employer. But obviously it was for publicity to have the Sheik go down there and do this, but they did a lot of publicity together. There's funny things in the press at the time of people talking about reporters saying how, during these press conferences, the Sheik would mysteriously gain the ability to speak a few sentences of English when somebody would ask him a question. I guess he made an exception for Muhammad Ali, but it was very important to the Sheik. People told me that he had a picture of him and Ali. There's a picture floating around. People could even find it of Ali with the Sheik in a headlock or vice versa or something. And the Sheik had that picture in his home. He actually had it. People said on when he was dying at home that they saw the picture on his nightstand by his bed of him and Muhammad Ali. So that was something that was important to him, understandably.
Jerry, was it you and your brother on that card? You were on that card, weren't you?
No.
I thought your brother was on the card.
Jack was on the Shea Stadium card.
On the Shea Stadium card. But the show that Ali and Inoki were on, the American version, which was simulcast with it, was your brother, right?
My brother, yes, Jack,
yeah.
Out of Shea Stadium.
Yeah, because they got worried about what they were going to do pay-per-view wise or closed circuit wise, different terminology, but
exactly.
Right, because there was a little bit of fear setting in because they started realizing, well, not a lot of American fans, especially at that time, know who Antonio Inoki was. And in fact, I think there was even Vince Sr., there was a moment, I think, where he was trying to make it Inoki, or rather Muhammad Ali versus Sammartino. But that wasn't the deal that was made. The deal grew up originally between Ali and Inoki directly. I mean, it was made directly.
Who set that deal up? Do you have any research on that?
I think there was a story where Inoki had said something in the press about how wrestlers could beat boxers, and he made some kind of remark about wanting to fight Muhammad Ali. And I think because, one of the things about Inoki with the whole fighting spirit thing, it was very important to him to show and prove that wrestlers were the best combat athletes that there were. And so that was a really big thing for him. And that's why a lot of times he would have these mixed martial artists and things on his shows and judo guys and things like that. And I think it was Inoki who made the offer, because initially Ali, it was something that would have been laughed off. But I think he got off.
Probably would have challenged a States guy if he would.
Right. But he got offered a lot of money, and that's what made him go, well, maybe this isn't such a bad idea. I think it was in the millions that he got offered to do this. And I guess Inoki must have had backers or something. And that's when he said, well, I think I could lower myself to get in the ring with a wrestler for that much money. I think some of the people around Ali were not happy about it, though, and they were not thrilled.
The boxing community as a whole was not happy, if I recall right.
Right. My grandfather was a boxing coach, and he was involved in a lot of Golden Gloves fighting and things like that. And I remember he would always tell me that, how it was like they considered it a disgrace. It really was not well regarded in the boxing world. Why is Ali doing this? That kind of thing.
Yeah, back to Sheik. Throughout all the promoters, there's always stories about them breaking in local guys. Well, the Sheik wasn't any different. There was George Animal Still, Jim Myers, who was a school teacher and a coach, not too far away. and also across the border there, Larry Shreve, who was Abdul the Butcher. He gave both those guys, plus his nephew, a little bit later on, gave all those guys an opportunity. Was he, was his training? Was he bringing in guys and breaking them in for his territory, or what? How what was the philosophy behind that?
Yeah, there were people like that. Tim Brooks was another one who would always. I talked to him right before he passed for the book, and he was eternally grateful. He was one of those people who liked the Sheik. He was very grateful for the break that he got there, and he really became a star there. And
I didn't
Sheik
realize
had,
that Killer was started with the Sheik.
well, he didn't start there, but he got a really big break there.
Yeah.
He really became a major star, and Sheik helped get him booked in Japan and things like that. And he later moved on to a lot of other things, but he really got his first taste of good money working there.
I see now where Killer got it. Killer and I were good friends. We worked together a lot. I see now where Killer got it because Killer was nuts.
Well, there you go. That's it.
Good,
And
good, solid dude. I loved Killer. Killer was a really good guy and a great heel. Killer was a terrific heel. But
well,
you see now where he gets it.
Sheik had a thing where he really liked bringing in very good heels because he recognized the fact that he's on top all these years, Sheik, and he's a heel on top of it, which is really hard to do. You know, it's easy to do if you're Bruno, everybody loves you and they want to see you win every month. It's hard to do when everybody wants to see you lose and all you do is win. It's hard to keep that going. And so he had a thing where he would bring in people. Pampero Firpo was another one who he loved, and he got to know him out in Hawaii and California, and he brought him, and he had Brooks, and there were other people like that where what he would do is they were younger than he was, so they could carry a lot of the weight in the matches, and then eventually if they started to get more heat than him, he would turn them babyface. He was notorious for doing that too, and he didn't ever want them to get bigger than he was, you know. But he had a training school. Lou Klein was the one that ran it. It was in Williamston, in Michigan, which is the town where the Sheik lived. And he had a gym there, and he would bring people in, and like a lot of wrestling promotions had in those days. That was his kind of training ground for developing new talent, and also if you're bringing in people that maybe were a little untested, just making sure to see what they could do. And so he actually relied on Lou Klein a lot for that.
Did Sheik have many close friends? The reason I ask that is you don't hear a lot of people talking about the Sheik. Was he a guy that had close friends? I mean, you hear things, from Sheik, later in his years when the company was doing bad, he had some unpaid bills and things, which, that tends to happen when a company's going, belly up. But he has started at the beginning of his career. You don't hear a lot of people that were good friends with Sheik. Did Sheik have a lot of close friends?
He had a very small circle. He wasn't one of those people that was a friend to everybody. He just wasn't. He had a tight, closed circle. But if you were in that circle, those would be his friends. And one of them, I know this is going to, sound crazy, but I think we could say it 50 years later, Bobo Brazil was one of his best friends in the business. That was part of the reason they wrestled each other about 80,000 times, because they could, they trusted each other. And in fact, there's a story in the book that would have made people's heads explode at the time. But when Bobo was going through a divorce, he lived at the Sheik's house when he was fighting with his wife over whatever, the house or whatever it was. The Sheik had that gigantic house in Williamston, huge mansion. And the Sheik stayed, Bobo Brazil stayed there. They were actually very close. I think he was very close with the Currys. He was close, him and Wild Bull Curry, because Wild Bull Curry had sort of been like his predecessor. He was the wild man before the Sheik, and Curry had his son, Flying Fred Curry, who was really good friends. I think I actually he's still around. I got to talk to Fred.
Fred's still around?
Yeah, he lives in upstate Connecticut, not too far from me, not in the greatest health, but he's still around. And in fact, it was so important to me to talk to him because him and Terry Funk at the time because this was 5 years ago, they were the only people still around who had been headliners in Detroit for the Sheik. There were a few people around who maybe were just breaking in and starting out, but they were the guys that had been headliners. And Curry said he liked them a lot, but even he said, in later years, that this was the problem. The Sheik really burned a lot of bridges, and I guess this is one of the reasons, I guess, his family was very hesitant to work with me. There was a dark side to his story. In the later years, he in business burned bridges. He got heavily involved in gambling. He did have a drug problem.
Did you ever see the mansion that he had? Because there was so many rumors back in my day about this thing, and he had several different wings of this gigantic mansion, and he had to end up selling it during the downtime there. Can you kind of describe that place?
Yeah, I was in it. So they turned it into a bed and breakfast in it's
the Sheik family, or
no, they sold it around in the early 80s when they were really having financial problems.
So it's around it's currently there as a bed and breakfast.
You can have your wedding at the Sheik's mansion. And so this is a funny thing. It was in the 80s it got turned into this, and the original owners, they wanted nothing to do with the Sheik or the legacy, or they thought that would actually scare business away. I'm going to have my wedding at the place where this lunatic lived,
Somebody come out so far.
But it just got a new owner, and I think they're embracing it. They're actually making it. This was the home of our local legend. But I went down there. I was on a book tour in Michigan, and I was with my daughter, and I can say this now, but they were very strict. They didn't do tours. They didn't want people gaping at the place and all that stuff, and they were trying to be we're a serious establishment. They probably got fans coming there trying to get in. So I went down there with my daughter, and we posed as my daughter was getting married, and we were shopping around looking for places to do. I'm her father, and and we're looking around, and could we have a look at this place? We might want to have a wedding here, and all this. I did this. I'm sorry. It's different owners.
Wow, Brian, you're bringing out knowledge about you.
And they brought us in there, showed us around. It still had a lot of the 70s decor, the shag carpets, the mirror.
Did you ever slip at any point and go, oh, that's a Sheik shag carpet?
Well, I think I showed a little too much interest because I think they started to think something was up. I was lingering in some of the rooms and really looking at some of the decor and thinking, in my head, like who was in this room, and I think eventually they were like, well, who did you say your name was again? And when is this wedding taking place? and then we kind of got out of there, but I got to go inside. It's huge. I think it's like 40 rooms.
You know what square footage was or anything like that?
I think it's 40 rooms. It had I don't know if it's still, it has like a 5 or 6 car garage. At one point underneath it had an in-ground pool, and the gym was underneath the pool, and the pool had a glass floor, so you could see the people swimming when you were in the gym working out. People would be swimming above you. I mean, the place was massive, and it's on a river. It has all this property around it. Absolutely massive. You have to pull off the road. It's like you're approaching like a castle or something. You pull off the road and you have to drive all the way down this country road just to get to the property. I mean, absolutely huge.
Wow. And Sheik made that much money?
At his peak, yes. I wrote in the book how in something like 71 or 2, which were his hottest period, that he declared something like $600,000 income.
What are you inferring by that? By he declared
it. What I'm inferring, it was probably a lot more than that. And you're talking about a time when the average person's salary was, I don't know, $10,000 a year or something like that. I mean, I think even Bruno at that time was maybe making $200,000 a year. So I mean, he was making untold amounts of money for a while. He was living like like a
paying anybody.
Right. That's what happens when you don't pay anybody. He was just keeping all, but it all went out.
670 was what you said it was?
Was what? Oh, this was about 71, 72.
What was the amount he declared?
600,000.
600. Wow.
Yeah. And so that there were a lot of, like, for example, when he would wrestle in Japan, that was all cash. He was being paid cash money. In fact, he would load up his boots with the cash and come home without, so you didn't have to go through customs or anything and unload.
That's just dishonest. I don't know anybody who would do something like that. That's horribly dishonest.
Yeah,
I
I
don't know
know.
anybody who would stick
Great
money down
government
their
like
pants or
that.
in
I
their
can't
boots or
believe that.
anything.
I can't imagine it. No,
Especially a pair of
unthinkable.
brothers that might have $250,000 from Baba. I don't know what brothers would do that. Maybe the Briscoes.
I don't know, man.
Yeah, in case you didn't know, Brian.
Staying with the Sheik here, John.
No, in case you didn't know, $250,000 was put down the Briscoes' pants and smuggled back to Hawaii.
I don't even know where you'd fit all that. I mean, I don't want to know, but man, that's a lot of money because even the
I
weight.
don't know what was declared.
Well, that's what I mean when I say there was a lot of money being made, a lot. And
that's unbelievable. I knew some of those guys made huge money. That's huge.
Yeah.
Did you happen to know the
massive
value
money
of that house? I mean, that house always intrigued because that was always rumored with the boys. Well, don't go to Detroit because she's got this mansion and they don't paying for his house there.
Well, I guess a lot of times he would let the guys stay there if they were in the territory and they didn't have a place to stay.
Bubble stayed there. I know.
But yeah, like I was saying, he stayed there during the divorce, but many other times people would stay. In fact, Kevin Sullivan told me an incredible story because Kevin worshiped the Sheik. He was like, he absolutely idolized him. And he said that he was absolutely crazy about the kayfabe stuff. He said, when you came to the house, the heels and faces had to be separate at the house. At his house. He said they would be sitting in the yard because he had this gigantic, it's not to call it a yard. It was just huge. And he would have barbecues and things. And he would have the heels at a table on one side and the faces at a table on the other side at his house. And people would say, well, why are we doing this? No one's here but us. And he absolutely insisted that he had to keep it up. Maybe it's because they were outside. Maybe he thought people were taking pictures from the sky. I don't know what he was thinking, but he kept it going. If you stayed at his house, you had to do that. Greg Valentine.
I know Kevin. You're right about him worshiping the Sheik because as Kevin went to that dark side, that's where a lot of Kevin's ideals and the way he treated his valets too was exactly like
that's right.
That's right. That's true. Yeah, he really did learn a lot from Sheik. He really looked up to him.
What was the relationship with Toronto? I've always been kind of impressed or interested very strongly in, I guess is a better phraseology, about Toronto, Detroit, Montreal, those three territories, how they kind of interworked with each other, but specifically Detroit and Toronto. Sheik at one point, was he booking both at one point?
He was. He was booking Toronto for years, from the early 70s into the late 70s. In fact, almost like there were a lot of people who had the misconception that the two promotions were one and the same, that Detroit and Toronto were almost like wings of the same promotion. Of course they weren't, because you had the Tunnies in Toronto, but the thing was their business was hurting, and they saw the business Sheik was doing when he was really on fire, and they said, well, we got to start bringing this guy in, and he started booking in Toronto, and that is also why he went on an undefeated streak. You want to talk about the Undertaker streak? So this is in the book. 127 matches at the Maple Leaf Gardens without a loss. Okay. And so people would come.
This is no Goldberg streak. This is an actual streak, right?
This was real. I put the results in the book. I confirmed it. And the crazy thing was, it didn't matter who came through. If you look at the people, Thez, Jack Briscoe, and I don't mean by pin. A lot of times it would be disqualification or something like that. But no one beat him. Pat O'Connor, Whipper Billy Watson. Didn't matter who it was.
Who's who?
Right. They came through, and even if there was a funny kind of finish, nobody beat the Sheik for all these matches. And it got to the point where it became ridiculous. And just like he did in Detroit, he did it in Toronto. The turning point, and it's in the book, was when they brought in Andre the Giant. And even Andre the Giant didn't beat the Sheik. They had some kind of a ridiculous finish where Andre lost by count out because I guess the Sheik hit him with fire, and he got so distracted that he lost by count out. And that was the point where people say that the fans had enough. They just thought, how ridiculous is this? And then the business started to die out in Toronto too. And that's when the Tunnies started working with other people like Crockett and the McMahons and the AWA and getting talent from other places. And it's just part of that whole thing of the Sheik just constantly burning bridges all, in those later years.
Was the Sheik the first to use fire? And if he was, where did he get it? Where did he get the idea?
He was the first to do it. As far as I could research, he was the absolute first.
Now,
he
when
got
we
it.
say the first on this show, that we usually get disproved there. So
Okay, well, people could try to disprove. I'm putting my name on it. I'm saying it. He was the first to use it in pro wrestling, and a lot of people got it from him. Jerry Lawler, in fact, said that he learned it directly from him when the Sheik came into Tennessee when he was working with people like Jackie Fargo and stuff.
The Sheik did beat Lawler in Tennessee.
Well, he taught him how to throw fire. And there were other people that did it too. I think Great Mephisto did it.
Mephisto was another disciple of the Sheik.
He took a lot from Sheik, but he got it from illusionists, so magicians that would do the trick. I don't know where he first saw it, but they would do it where we're going to break kayfabe on everything, magic, wrestling, everything. They would have these things that they would wear on their fingers that would have like a flint thing where you could just rub your fingers together. It looked like magic. And if you had a piece of flash paper in your hand, you could just rub your fingers together and they would immediately go on fire. And that was how he first learned how to do it, with the flint things on his fingers. Later on, it got a little more lazy, where he would just have a Bic lighter tucked into his trunks, and he would, and it a lot of times he would because I even have this in the book. So the Bic lighter was invented at a certain point in the 70s because they used to have those big Zippos. You couldn't really hide those in anywhere. They were those big giant metal lighters. When they came out with the little tiny one that you just would do that with, he switched over to that. And it's a little more obvious. You could watch him fumbling around with it and things like that. But he learned it from magicians. Yeah, that's where he got it from.
Skandar Akbar used to have the greatest thing to go reach for the fire. He would look around, and then he would very secretly reach into his pocket like this. As he's looking around. It was the hokiest thing you ever did. I bet I've seen him do it 20 or 30 times. Then he'd pull it out and then he'd light it and throw the flame, It was so bad. The hand would always be like this. Not so nobody could see it. Pull the lighter out and get the flame paper.
Very subtle.
Yeah. It was awesome.
Pencil too.
What's that?
A pencil.
No, Akbar didn't have the pencil, but Akbar loved the fire.
Oh,
Akbar, the Sheik, though, that was, yeah. Why did he ever talk to you about why he came up with a pencil?
Well, he would wrap this.
That's why.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it was the pencil he was using a book. I don't know, but it was sort of like his trademark. Like Abdullah had the fork and Sheik had the pencil. And actually, to tell you the truth, a lot of times it wasn't even really a pencil. Like there's some collectors that have some of these things. Dave Brzezinski being one of them, who was Sheik's last manager. And a lot of times it would just be something wrapped in athletic tape, and it could have been anything, honestly. It could have been a popsicle stick. It could have been anything. The announcers would always say a pencil, and maybe sometimes it was, but it was just something that he could easily hide in his trunk.
We a lot of times would use athletic tape wrapped around athletic tape.
Right,
we would. Remember, Jerry, you just put something in it, like, oh, he's got brass knuckles.
So you just wrap it
yeah,
up.
you just wrap a bunch of stuff up, put it up, you use it as a gimmick.
Yeah, and the announcers would always call it a pencil, and he was another one who was just the master of the blade. I mean, that might be the thing he's the most known for. He would just wake up in the morning and just start bleeding, spontaneously.
The rumors back in the day when I was starting, the Sheik was really hot. Was that he had taped those? He had those razors on him like 24/7. If he get hot at somebody, he'd just gig them.
I can tell you, especially when he was working, he did. I
Yeah.
mean, he would walk around that way, and even as a way of defending himself. Yeah.
You know, that if you got a little snug with him, he'd gig you or something like that.
I talked to a referee who told me that he bladed him and he didn't even know it was happening. Like he didn't even tell him he was going to do it or anything. He said all of a sudden, my face. He didn't even realize that he had touched him. He said all of a sudden my face started feeling cold. I didn't know why, and I reached up and it was because all the blood was leaving my face.
Well, his Sheik was definitely a master of the blade. I don't, certainly wasn't the first, but as far
No.
as great blade guy goes, Sheik is probably considered as the what a way to be remembered, the best blade guy in the business.
I saw his student Killer Tim Brooks blade a guy in the locker room one time. You know how the young guys, you have the old vets making a blade, and they kind of kayfabe in the corner, even with the young guys around. So one of the young guys was there, and he'd never seen it before. He one of his first matches. So as Killer's walking out, he goes, "Hey, are you making a blade?" And Killer looked over and goes, "Yeah." He goes, "Bam," and gigged him. Just walked to the ring. He's covered in blood in the dressing room. Just walked out.
The Sheik is one, John, where Gary Hart got his money blade idea from.
You had told me that. I forgot about that. Sweet Lucy, the business blade.
Yeah. Right, all right, Brian?
Well, he would, yeah. Well, Gary Hart was the Sheik's manager a lot of times when he'd be in Texas, because the thing was, the Sheik had a lot of times in those days the managers didn't travel, right? So Sheik had Ernie Roth in Detroit, and later he would have Eddie Creechman, who never really left the Montreal, Toronto, Detroit area. So when Sheik went to Texas, a lot of times he had Gary Hart, so that would explain that.
Yeah, Gary had a blade. He called him Sweet Lucy, carrying the bottom of a cigarette case. He
had a regular blade for regular. Then he had, when he wanted to draw money, he had a money blade.
The business blade, yeah.
Well, he had the Sheik would, if fans would get too close, sometimes you take a swing at fans. I mean, it's almost unthinkable to think of today, but there were times where if there was going to be a riot or whatever, he absolutely would take a swing with it. Lanny Poffo told me another story. He said when he was first starting as a rookie, he was in a match with the Sheik, a tag team match or something, and it really broke down. It was bad. People were starting to pour into the ring through the ropes. And Lanny, who's a young kid, he's a young, strong, young guy, and he's looking at the Sheik, who at that point was an older looking guy, and he's thinking, I have to protect him. What if something happens? I got to make sure people don't get too close to him. And he said, I saw the Sheik, this guy got close. I saw the Sheik reach out like it was nothing and just slash him like across the arm or the chest or something. And the guy just started bleeding everywhere. And he said, in that moment, I realized the Sheik didn't need any help from me. But he also said the visual of it too. I mean, you can laugh about it because the Sheik did it every day, but seeing that as a 19, 20-year-old just getting in the business, he said it was like he almost had PTSD from seeing it. Like it was stuck in his head. He said for weeks, this guy just bleeding everywhere, but he was not above doing that.
Yeah, and that's what's hard for people to believe. What Jerry was talking about was, the guys like that, Abdullah notoriously did. Don't know if that was true or not, that's why he carried it. The Sheik, apparently that is why he carried it. He carried that blade in case somebody messed with him. He'd carry an extra blade on his fingertip or his wrist or somewhere. And I mean, to today's fans, that sounds absolutely insane. But when these old guys, you're like, yeah, that not only wasn't insane, that actually happened. It may have been insane, but it happened.
It even sounds crazy, even from a lawsuit point of view. I mean, forget about you'd be thinking, man, these people are going to sue us out of business. But I just think people were, I don't know, less litigious or whatever. It was not a concern. Certainly not a concern.
Right.
Well, Brian, take us to the days towards the end there. What is this? I like the way you worded a mockumentary. What is that your word or what?
Yeah. You're talking about I like to hurt people, right?
Yeah, I like to hurt people. I like to hurt people. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a movie that was made about the Sheik's territory, and it was
this movie. Can you find it anywhere? Or
yeah, you can. It's in fact, I think it was just recently re-released because the guy that owns the rights to it, Brian Greenberg, he was one of the directors of it, re-released it recently. But it's one of those cult wrestling movies. They made it in the 70s when the Sheik's promotion was still going. And so there's actual footage. This is what's so incredible about it. you don't see a lot of, especially really high quality footage of wrestling from the 70s. And they had camera guys in the ring. I mean, absolutely beautiful, crystal clear. You could see Sheik, Abdullah, the Funks, Dusty Rhodes. They did Andre the Giant. And so it had a storyline basically where this guy was trying to start up a coalition to have the Sheik banned. You know, it was for the movie. And so this guy is following the Sheik around, and other wrestlers are desperately trying to stop the Sheik in his reign of terror and all this thing. And in the process, they filmed all this footage of Detroit big time wrestling. Now, the movie sat on a shelf for whatever reason. They just walked away from it. They didn't edit it together. They left all the footage. And then years later, when wrestling was incredibly hot in the mid 80s with the WWF and everything else, and video, VHS and home video is becoming really big, these guys got back together. They re-edited all the footage together, and they released the movie in 1985. Now, the Sheik was already out of business by that point. Big time wrestling was a memory. The Sheik was still around wrestling, but he was not at all a mainstream star anymore. And the movie became this kind of weird underground video store hit. I found out about it when I was a kid, and it's called I Like to Hurt People. If you watch it, it's sort of like it pretends to be a documentary. You know, that's the whole mockumentary thing. It's obviously all, you know, a work, but it's a lot of fun.
So Sheik later after the territory ended and all that, chose not to work or whatever happened, chose not to be in partnership with Vince McMahon as he expanded at the WrestleMania era. But then he came back with Onita. Of course, Sabu became this massive, massive star. And we've had Sabu on here, you know, terrific interview. It's wonderful story of him training with the Sheik. And then, of course, ECW and all that. How was the Sheik's later years? Was he a happy guy? Was, you know, it always interests me as, you know, guys get older. Some guys become better. Some guys become happy. Some guys, you know, don't care. Some guys just move on. How was Sheik in his later years?
Well, the 80s was a very tough time for him. He was really out in the cold. It's really ironic because wrestling was maybe the biggest it had ever been, and he was completely out in the cold. He was not a part of it. He was doing a lot of indie wrestling. He actually went into semi-retirement by about 1982. He was only taking a few dates a year for a while, and he was going into bankruptcy. He lost his house. He lost a lot of things. His marriage almost ended. It was a really bad time. But then in the 90s, now Onita he used to work for Baba. He was kind of like he was a young boy. He used to carry wrestlers' bags and things. And he remembered Sheik from those days, and other people too, Terry Funk, you know, things like that. So when he's starting his own promotion, FMW, he's thinking, I want to bring in some of these legends, these American legends that the Japanese fans still remember and they're nostalgic about. Is the Sheik still alive? Where is he? Is he still working? Let's find him. And they found him. And the Sheik at that point for like 3-4 years. And this is a guy who's close to 70. He went back to working full time. There was a couple of reasons. One was obviously the money. The money he was being paid was beyond belief. I tried to get hammered down an exact amount. It was something like $10,000 a week. Somebody even was telling me $10,000 a match, which would be insane.
I heard the week myself.
And at that point, he also needed money very badly. He was trying to stave off another bankruptcy, losing another house. And the other reason was he was trying to help out Sabu. So Sabu was just starting. He was not a known person. He'd been wrestling for 3-4 years, not well known, wrestling just in the area. And the Sheik basically made a deal with Onita. If you want me, my nephew's coming with me. And we think about it now. I mean, of course we'd want Sabu, but they didn't know who he was. So who is this guy? Well, I'm not coming. If you don't take him, I'm not coming. And so part of it was he wanted to make his nephew a star. That was a big part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. You know, Sabu talks very highly about his uncle. You know, that's pretty cool that he takes care of a family member like that. That's, you know, that's what you want to happen.
In fact, there's a funny story. He might have told this story, but when Sabu was first starting to wrestle, when he was even just wrestling under other names, he didn't wrestle the way that we know. He was very conventional, like the Sheik. And that was partly the Sheik's influence. So the Sheik is training him, he's training RVD, and he's saying, guys, I need you to work a headlock. I need you to work a hold. I need you to make it look like a fight. Don't be doing all this crazy stuff. So he's telling him that for years. And meanwhile, all Sabu and then RVD wanted to do was all the flying, you know, and anytime Sheik would leave, go inside when they were training, he'd go to the bathroom or go to get a cup of coffee. They would start doing all that stuff. And there's a story in Sabu's book that when they're on the plane to go to Japan for the first time, they're together and for the first time they're going there, and the Sheik turns to his nephew and he goes, listen, you know, all that stuff that you and Rob were doing all those years and I didn't want you to do and I told you not to do, when we go over there I want you to do all that stuff. he said break out all the stops and do it all, and sure enough that's what made him a star.
What was Sheik's reason to get blackballed from the NWA?
So that happened after his business went under in 81. Like I was saying, he was very bitter. He felt betrayed. He felt betrayed by Barnett. He felt like the other promoters didn't help him enough to keep him in business. Like they hung him out to dry. And so he started working with outlaws. There was the story with Jim Wilson and Thunderbolt Patterson. And when they were running opposition at the Omni, the Sheik signed up with them. And he was working with the Pafos in Kentucky and things like that. Basically, he was going, look, he was trying to survive. He was going wherever he could go to make money, and people that were willing to work with him. The Pafos loved him, so he went there. And that pissed off enough people. I mean, I think the last straw was running the Omni. I think when he was a part of that, they cut him off, and that really hurt him badly because Baba was also an NWA member, so that meant he couldn't even go to Japan. He was really stuck, and he stopped going to Japan.
With that group, Eddie Einhorn's group, Eddie?
They were well, they were. That was a few years before, but actually, there's a story in the book where Einhorn tried to pull him over, and he was loyal. That was another reason that the Sheik was bitter, because Einhorn tried to get him on board with the IWA, and he was trying to go national in like, what was it, 76, 77. And the Sheik said no. The Sheik put his foot down and said, I'm not going to turn on all my friends. I'm not going to, this is going too far. I won't do it. And then he felt like a few years later, all the NWA promoters gave up on him. So he said, well, screw those guys. You know, I don't, why should I be loyal to people that aren't loyal to me? So he started doing his own thing. And at the 1981 convention, they voted to blackball him. And the year after that, he decided to go into semi-retirement because there was hardly anywhere to work.
It seems like it's, you know, they almost did the same thing to San Martino. You know, San Martino had a falling out with Vince Sr., and he was booked on a town that he didn't know he was booked on. Funny how that happens. And all of a sudden, the commission bans him because he no-showed a city that he was never knew that he was supposed to be at. And he couldn't work anywhere, you know, because of the NWA. You know, the NWA could be some really good things. They also did some, I think, some really negative things as well. You know, with people like, you know, like you talk about with Sheik, you blackball a guy, and all of a sudden he can't make a living right at the end of his career. You know, there's some real negatives that go along with some of the monopoly the NWA had.
Oh, no doubt about it. I mean, it was, if it wasn't a monopoly, it was the closest thing you could have to one. And then especially when Vince came in and he wasn't going to work with him, well, that's it. I mean, that was an opportunity. Where else could you go at that point? The only reason he later on got a couple of shots, or maybe one, with Crockett, and that's because Kevin Sullivan was there and they were doing the Great American Bash. And he said, well, we're going through Detroit. We're going to Cobo. Let's get the Sheik. And this is 1988. And that was the last time that he really got booked on a major American show.
What do you think the legacy of the Sheik is? And the reason I ask that is not just a typical question at the end of an interview. What do you think the legacy of the subject is? The reason is because, as we talked about at the very beginning, there's so little talked about with the Sheik. You know, there's so many other promoters. You know, I guess Roy Shire, maybe you mentioned, would be comparable. You know, that were ended before the big heyday of the wrestling and didn't go on to the, you know, the WrestleMania type era and the wars and things. Maybe that was it. But what do you think the legacy of the Sheik is in wrestling, both as a promoter as an innovator and as a wrestler?
I think there's two things. So as a performer, the legacy of the Sheik is, at least in my opinion, and I did the work, that he was pretty much the best drawing heel that the business ever had, especially during the heyday of the territories. He was a guy who, and I didn't say this first, I think Jim Cornette said this, but he drew more money in more places for more time as a heel than anybody else ever did. So he could go anywhere he wanted and immediately be plugged in the main event anywhere for a long amount of time, basically from about early 60s to the late 70s. He was about as hot as you could be as a heel. I mean, and there were years where it's been broken down who was the biggest attraction of each year, you know, and for a lot of those years it's Bruno, but for a few of those years and consecutively it's Sheik. And to do that as a heel, that's the thing. To do that as somebody who people hate, you know, it's one thing to do it because they're coming there to support you, but to do it because they're coming there to see you lose and to keep it going. Because the problem is, obviously, when you're a heel in that spot is supposedly you eventually have to lose, right? And when you do, then your heat starts to go away. You have to go somewhere else. And he figured out a formula. Well, it's not really that complicated, just never lose, but he figured out it was the Roddy Piper formula. He figured out a formula where I can keep this going. So as a performer, I think that's incredibly impressive. I'm not going to put him. I know, John, you wrote the foreword for the Jim Londos book, which I just finished, and it's a fantastic book that Steve Johnson wrote. He's not in a class of Londos. I don't think anybody is. But in terms of being a heel and doing that, unequaled.
That's an incredible statement, and you're a historian, and I think I agree with you. I hadn't thought about that before. I always consider Gorgeous George probably the greatest heel, at least in my opinion. But you very well have a great point. Okay, so as heels, if he's the greatest heel, who would be in the running for being there with him in all of history? Say the next two or three heels. You don't have to put them in order, but you say that would be in running with the Sheik for that title.
It's hard to say because when you get into the modern era, it's like the whole business changes. Like it's apples and oranges. How could you? Well, not only that, right? Who's the heel? But how could you compare that to a Roman Reigns or a Roddy Piper or a Triple H? It's because the business is so different. I guess the big difference with Sheik is he was not bounded up by the one company. You know, he could go anywhere, work for anybody. It didn't matter. So if you're talking about that type of a heel, but Killer Kowalski would be on the list. Buddy Rogers, Freddie Blassie would be on the list of people that were able to maintain a lot of heat everywhere they went for a really long time. Because that's the key is in those days, you're talking about guys that could go anywhere. It's different today.
And the bottom line too, Sheik was a gimmick heel. I mean, you know,
yes.
It wasn't one of those grasping type heels that have the longevity. A gimmick heel has a shorter lifespan than.
And that's the thing. Gorgeous George, this is the difference, and I'll qualify it like somebody like when people say, for example, that's Steve Austin. A lot of people will say, and I think there's truth to it, was the hottest draw of all time in terms of ticket sales, merchandise, and all that. But you're talking about a very narrow window of time. Unfortunately, it was only a few years because of his health and his body and all that stuff. The difference is the longevity. So like somebody like Gorgeous George, he was, I think, at his peak, a bigger star than Sheik for sure, but it didn't last to the same degree. I mean, he had this really steep fall where by the time you get to the end of the 50s, it's almost like he's forgotten about what is, you know, he's forced to do hair matches to keep people interested, you know, basically, and work for people he never would have worked for before. Whereas, and that eventually happened to the Sheik, but it took a lot longer. You're talking about the better part of 15, 20 years where he's the number one heel in the business.
Yeah.
But the other part of
Go ahead.
I was going to say the other part of the legacy, though, outside of the wrestling, is the cautionary tale. And I think it's important, which is that no matter how big you get, if you're not smart And if you succumb to the demons of the business and very bad business decisions, you will fall. You see a promotion that goes from, you could make a case in 69, 70, 71. You could make a case that Detroit Big Time Wrestling was the hottest promotion in the country. So to go from that to being just a few years later, by 77, 78, to just being an afterthought, a company that's on its last legs, dying, that drastic change, that doesn't matter how big or successful you get, those things can happen if you make the wrong choices in your personal life and in your professional life.
Brian, you mentioned demons in your notes and just now. What were Sheik's demons?
So there were things that I understand that his family would not want to come out, and there's reasons why they didn't want to work with me. And some things were known in terms, he with gambling, he definitely had issues with that. I mean, a lot of wrestlers like to gamble. Gorilla Monsoon was a huge blackjack player. The difference was Gorilla Monsoon usually won. You know, that was the difference. Whereas the Sheik did not. He had very bad luck. He ran into some drug issues, unfortunately. The Sheik had a gallbladder surgery, and in those days there was no laparoscopic. In those days it was like the frog in biology class. I mean, when they had to get something out of you, and it was a really invasive procedure. They put him on painkillers, and he insisted on still working with, regardless of that. He had a gigantic gash across his abdomen, and he's in the ring without a shirt on, and that led to other things, led to hard drugs, heroin, things like that. And that's very bad news when you're doing that and all your money's going into that. He had a lot of marriage problems, which, look, a lot of wrestlers have that. But
they married to the same lady all those
years? He did, but it was very bad. The problem was that, not a problem, but the issue was that Joyce was also very well liked in the business. His wife, she was his business manager. A lot of the other promoters really loved her. And so when he was, doing things like when they split up and he had a girlfriend and things like that, and the other promoters were very put off by that. I remember Jeff Walton, who worked for Mike LaBelle in LA, and Mike LaBelle was very close with the Sheik. He got very uncomfortable working with Sheik because the Sheik would come out there and try to make sure that he had a job for his girlfriend and things like that. And it was making people very uncomfortable because everybody really loved Joyce. And I think that created a lot of ill will towards him in the business. So when you combine all those things, plus the insistence on keeping yourself on top and the really bad creative decisions, not making any new stars, you could watch a big time wrestling show in 1977 or 78 and you'd see pretty much all the same people you'd seen in 74 and 75. And it was the same matches and feuds. And when you combine all those things, it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that happened a lot with past generations. My generation and before me, had a lot of issues that the generations today don't have because of the way the business has changed. The business has changed now to where you have medical staff, you have concussion testing, you have drug testing, you have all this wonderful stuff. I heard somebody say something bad about wrestling the other day, and they were big football guys, and I said, talking about the wrestler with the movie is like talking about North Dallas 40 to the NFL. They're neither one of the same that they were back 30 years ago. They've all completely changed for a lot better. So, it's right. Unfortunately, Gorgeous George is the same thing. When you're on the road like that, and you're in a society where all of that's okay, which it's changed now. Right. Those things tend to happen, and you have unhappy endings for a lot of these guys, unfortunately. Which is a shame because he meant so much to the business.
Gorgeous George, when he died, the boys had to raise money to buy him a headstone. I mean, that's how broke he was. When you think about it, at the time, there was a point where he was as famous probably as Bob Hope, in a household name in America. Go from one to the other. And that was the thing with the Sheik too, like you said, with the health issues. If that had happened today, it would have been a laparoscopic procedure. He would have been in and out. But because of being heavily, what he had was, today we would call it an opioid addiction. That's what it turned into. It started from painkillers and it turned into other things. And I don't think that would have happened if it was today.
Yeah, because 30 years ago, nobody knew painkillers were that bad for you. Right. They really didn't. I was there. I know. I saw it everywhere. guys would just take Vicodin or whatever else. They didn't know how addictive it was. Then all of a sudden, everybody starts getting addicted and dying. And what they died from was the pills. You look at it, it's not necessarily the, drugs are drugs. Or, I'm not, but the pills is what was killing these guys. But the guys didn't know how bad they were, and now they do. It's the
Right.
world and the business has gotten so much better, which for a good thing. But these old guys that have done so much, they're just incredible characters, and you love looking at it because it was just a different time for him to make that much money and have to work for that many different promoters. That's a logistic nightmare to be able to put it all together while running a territory at the same time. I mean, that takes about 30 hours in the day to do all that stuff. It's a pretty cool record.
Yeah, it was insane. And his wife was very, very helpful. In fact, everybody said that it was Joyce who was writing the checks and signing the checks. And she supported him 100%, which is, again, why things got so bad for them, because she sort of felt like, well, I gave my life to this man. He dressed me up as a slave and I did whatever he said. And now he's going to do this to me. So it created a lot of bad feelings.
Is his wife still living?
No. She accepted the Hall of Fame plaque for him when they did it in 2007 in Detroit. She was still with us, but she passed, I want to say about 10 years ago now. Yeah.
You have another project coming up that'll be out in September. Tell us a little bit about what you got going on in your next book.
Yeah, so the next book is a very different kind of book, but a lot of the same era. It's called Irresistible Force: The Life and Times of Gorilla Monsoon, and it comes out September 30th. That's the official date now where it'll be out. I've been working on it now for a couple of years.
I was out in Vegas one time. I loved Gorilla. He was such a nice man. I didn't know him very well, but he asked me where I was staying, and I was embarrassed because I was staying in a really cheap hotel because I didn't have any money. And he goes, well, I got a room for you. I'm flying out tonight. He put me up in the gambler's suite in Caesar's Palace. It had everything but Mike Tyson's tiger in it. It was one of the cool. I just wanted to stay there all night. I didn't even want to go to sleep. I just wanted to look out and see the strip. It was so cool. He just wanted to do it for a young kid that he liked. It was so cool that he did that.
That's great.
I really like Gorilla. He was a nice man.
That's great to hear, because I didn't know. I was curious if you had any dealings with him. I know when you first came in there, he was still there, even though he was, I think he lost Joey by that point and he might not have been at his full power, but he was still there.
Yeah, still there. And the guys just loved him. Everybody loved Gorilla. He was so pleasant to be around. He'd tell you stories. If you could get him by himself and get him talking, he'd tell you stories. And it was a lot of fun talking to him.
That's great.
I'm looking forward to the book, and we'll have you on, I guess, again. When does the book actually come out? Do you know the date yet?
Yeah, September 30th is the official on sale. It'll probably start trickling out in late summer. It was supposed to come out this year in time for WrestleMania, but I blew my deadline. We had to push it back. But I just wanted to make it as thorough as I could, and I just it's been a lot of work. It's a huge book. It's going to be longer than the Sheik book.
Awesome. Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
Get a copy of it, John, so we can read it and be able to converse on it a little bit.
Without a doubt. Well, Mr. Briscoe, I talked to you for that book, so I was definitely planning on getting you a copy anyway. So you're getting one for sure. I'll send you one too, John. Don't worry.
Thank you very much. Most of the time, Mr. Briscoe gets a copy, and I buy one off of Amazon or something. It always happens that way. I've spent more money on wrestling books than Mr. Briscoe gets for free, and he gets them signed from people, like the authors. He gets them signed. I buy them off Amazon. I get like a signed receipt that I'm what I pay.
Mr. Amazon signs them, doesn't he?
That's right. That's right.
I'll get you one, I promise. Now I'm on the spot here, so I have to do it.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
All right, my pleasure. Thanks, guys.